Our guest of honour today comes to his new job after a 30-year career in the public service, where he played a pivotal role in developing and implementing IT and communications policy. He was Secretary of the Department of Communications, Information Technology and the Arts from 1993 until 2001. In that period, he was closely involved in telecommunications reforms, broadcasting and media policy, and the development of the Australian IT industry. Prior to this, he served as Secretary of the Industry Department from 1990 to 1993, following a 5-year tenure as Deputy Secretary of that department. He left the public service in 2001, which probably means we can't complain to him about the NBN, but maybe we could give it a try. More recently, he has taken on a range of assignments providing high-level policy and strategic advice in the public and private sectors. These roles have included chairing the NICTA, a large information and communication technology research centre which merged with elements of the CSIRO. Neville Stevens has never worked in the media, which of course is a prerequisite for him being appointed in January as Chair of the Australian Press Council. But his long history of dealing with politicians at the most senior levels and being at the centre of crucial decision-making in the digital stratosphere gives him a strong basis to lead the body overseeing standards in the print media in this country at a time of great change. Please welcome Neville Stevens.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that very kind introduction and that very comprehensive introduction. It makes me feel a little bit old sometimes when people say that. Let me first acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of this land. I'd also like to pay my respect to our elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation. I'm pleased to be here at the Melbourne Press Club. Mark has stolen my thunder a little bit in that this is the venue that my predecessor, Professor David Weisbrot, made his first public speech. As we all know, David resigned last year following the response to the appointment of Carla McGrath as a public member of the Council. I will address this issue later in my speech. David's departure was a loss to the Council, and I want to recognise the contribution he made during his tenure. He took a strategic view on Council matters and was a tireless advocate for press freedom. I'd also like to recognise the work done by Julie Kinross and John Doyle as acting chairs from the time of David's resignation to my appointment. And John Doyle is here in the audience today. Thank you, John. While I'm sure they enjoyed their time as acting chairs, it was also clear to me that they were both very relieved at my appointment, as I believe the Secretariat were as well. In his speech in 2005, David outlined the circumstances surrounding the approach to him by the executive search people, sipping a drink on a hotel balcony in Santorini. My experience was little more prosaic. I was driving back from Sydney to Canberra, just past Marulan, having stopped briefly there for a hamburger at Hungry Jack's, only to find it closed for renovations. I took the call, and the result is I'm here today. The reaction of my friends and others to my appointment was also interesting. One whom I'd approached to be a referee said at that time that he thought maybe I could do the job. Hopefully he was somewhat more positive when approached by the executive search people. Others were less encouraging, the general response being, why would you take a job like that? Well, I took the job because I believe the Press Council has an important role to play in maintaining a free and responsible press and in defending quality journalism, which is an essential element in our community. The press not only informs the public, but is fundamental to holding public and private entities accountable. I know from my time working in the federal government how critical that external scrutiny, and even more important, the possibility of external scrutiny, is in modifying and influencing behaviour. It is a critical check and balance in our system of government and a well-functioning civil society. But to fully achieve this role, the public must have confidence and trust in the integrity of the press, especially in this era of fake news. The Press Council plays a major role in encouraging high journalistic standards through its standards of practice and complaints handling system. Both are designed not to punish or shame publishers or publications, but rather to encourage quality journalism. I was also aware of it when approached that this is a time of great change for the media industry, and working in this challenging environment appealed to me. I've always enjoyed reading newspapers, and I grew up in Adelaide, and two things come to mind. The first is the arrival of the Australian to Adelaide. I was a teenager at the time, but managed to convince my father that he should subscribe to this paper in addition to the Advertiser and the News. He agreed, and this Eastern States morning paper used to be delivered in the afternoon. Another memory is at midnight, in the laneway behind the Advertiser building, waiting for the first edition to be thrown out so I could read my university exam results. These vignettes highlight the change in media over that period. Today it is 24/7. Available online wherever you are, constantly updated so that breaking stories can now be read on websites and not just available for radio and TV. It is inconceivable that today anyone would wait until the afternoon to read yesterday's news. The internet and the digital world have changed publishing forever. They've also changed and will continue to change the operation of the Press Council. One of the challenges for the Press Council is to reconcile these changes with its core function of promoting and upholding standards crucial to public trust in the media. These developments have brought significant benefits to the community for greater ease of access for readers, an explosion of digital-only publications, and the internet provides a way for content providers to reach a wider audience at low cost. Not all blogs, of course, are the same, but many are informative and provocative. The digital world has enabled more people to contribute to public dialogue and deliberation, many of whom are well informed and provide valuable perspectives to current debates. In Australia, there's been a rapid growth in digital-only publications. International publishers, such as the Daily Mail, New York Times and The Guardian, now have online Australian editions which add to the diversity of media in this country. But the digital world has also undermined the business model of publishing. Publishers traditionally relied on advertising revenue to supplement their subscription and sale revenues. It's not that long ago that you needed to be a weightlifter to bring inside the Saturday editions of the major metropolitan newspapers. Now Popeye, before his spinach injection, could lift them easily. The rapid rise of digital platforms such as Google and Facebook has had profoundly disruptive effects on publishers. These platforms now control the great bulk of digital advertising revenues, and it has been estimated that roughly 90% of growth in digital advertising is going to these two companies alone. The loss of these rivers of advertising gold has had a huge effect on the industry. Reduced revenues have led to significant job shedding. This loss poses a serious challenge to the ability of newspapers to consistently provide quality journalism and to undertake in-depth investigative reporting. Reporting which is essential if both the corporate world and governments are to be scrutinised and held to account. Accountability is vital to our community. That accountability requires quality journalism that has the trust of the community. Well-resourced newspapers to dig behind the sanctioned government leak and press statement and to get to the underlying issues. Reduced advertising revenues and subsequent job losses have put at risk that scrutiny, not just on a national or state basis, but also at a local level. With the best will in the world, the capital city media can only do so much, and inevitably they concentrate on national and state issues. It is the local media, the suburban or country town newspapers that can only really cover local issues. Their communities however, can only be involved in those activities and issues if they not only know about them, but also if there is a critical eye that goes beyond the local council's spin. Quality journalism needs to be well resourced. However, consumers are often reluctant to pay for this journalism. The Reuters Institute's latest digital news report in 2017 found across all countries that only around 1 in 10 pay for their online news. There's also evidence that news brands are starting to be recognised on these distribution platforms. In an experiment tracking more than 2,000 respondents in the UK, Reuters found that while most people could remember the path through which they found a news story, e.g. Facebook or Google, less than half could recall the name of a news brand when coming from search to social media. There is very legitimate concern that these tech giants wield a high level of market power, affecting the ability of content providers to negotiate commercially viable terms. There are recently some indications that these media platforms are reassessing their approach to news publishers. For example, Google has very recently launched a new initiative aimed at promoting legitimate journalism on the internet and helping publishers generate revenues from their journalism. In Australia, Fairfax is partnering with Google across several areas of its publishing business, including advertising, subscriptions, and product development. However, it's not just Google and Facebook that are becoming powerful in the news business. New research is showing that more and more people, around a quarter of respondents to the Reuters survey, now find, share, or discuss news using one or more messaging applications. It is becoming increasingly clear that communities and governments are concerned about the impact of the tech giants. While some of these companies may still try to portray themselves as little more than startups operating out of a garage in Palo Alto, this is no longer accepted. The recent Facebook controversies simply highlight the extent to which companies harvest and control data and the extent to which their algorithms have so much influence over the news we view and our daily lives. This story is still to unfold. In Australia, we have an ACCC inquiry underway into, among other things, the impact of the big digital platforms on the level of choice and quality of news and journalism content to consumers. The Press Council welcomes that inquiry and is making a submission. Then there is the issue of fake news I referred to earlier, and the impact it can have on national elections and public discourse in our community. It is important to recognise that fake news is actually not articles with factual inaccuracies resulting from human error, but rather it's information that is simply false and dressed up to appear as real news. Its creators' motivation is to influence public opinion for an outcome they desire and to profit from financially or otherwise. Unfortunately, there is an increasing tendency for people who don't like reporting to try and discredit it by labelling it as fake news, even where it may originate from a reputable source and may be completely accurate. So what do we need to do to combat and counter the negative effects of fake news? We need to be talking together about such things as the need for ever more rigorous checking of facts by journalists, not always an easy thing with fake news, and a potentially heavy new cost when publishers are struggling to remain profitable. We need to talk about the need for greater media literacy among information consumers. But we also need to be aware of the risk of governments resorting to excessive regulation, which may use the acknowledged dangers of false or manipulated information as a pretext to stifle press freedom. The latest Reuters Institute digital news report found that in a survey of news consumers in 36 markets around the world, that only 25% of respondents think social media do a good job in separating fact from fiction, compared to 40% for the news media. Other data suggests that users feel the combination of a lack of rules and secretive algorithms are allowing low-quality material and fake news to spread quickly. There is a yearning, I think, for quality journalism that consumers can trust. And recent data shows an upturn in the degree of trust consumers are placing on established quality media undertaking public interest journalism. The Reuters report found that amongst all the emerging rapid-fire sources of news and information, consumers clearly trust certain traditional media far more than social media or new entrants. And the traditional brands play an important role in, as the Reuters report puts it, creating trust and distributing common facts, particularly on serious issues like politics and international news. The report notes that in the US, after the last presidential election, the traditional news media gained 5 points from the prior year in terms of audience trust. At the same time, that subscription rates for some mastheads started to climb up for the first time in years. Recently, a new initiative designed to combat disinformation online, called the Journalism Trust Initiative, was launched in Europe. It is designed to promote quality journalism by adherence to agreed set of trust and transparency standards, developed and implemented by media outlets, professional associations and unions, self-regulatory entities like press councils, as well as digital platforms, advertisers and consumer interest representatives. So it's very similar to the approaches in Australia of the Press Council and its publisher members, where members have agreed standards of practice that reflect best journalistic practice and where members are accountable to an independent complaints handling system. One of the other big challenges facing the Australian Press Council, along with other press councils around the world, is the issue of local versus global production. How should a body like the Australian Press Council respond to complaints about an item on the Australian website of a global online news platform that is based in, say, London or New York, if a journalist in London files a piece that is compliant under the regulatory framework in the UK, and it then gets not just used in the UK edition, but also on the Australian website, whose jurisdiction is involved? Should readers in Australia expect that all items on an Australian news website, even if they are generated abroad, should meet Australian Press Council standards? Or should readers here and the Press Council accept that the local publishers of that website cannot be expected to control exactly what goes into a piece generated from overseas, and therefore not be expected to take responsibility for that piece and respond to complaints about it? This is an issue being looked at around the world by press council bodies, and the Australian Press Council is in a similar situation. And we are examining this issue, but to date, it has been the practice of the Council to hold the publisher member responsible for content they publish. While we recognise the changing business model of publishers, any changes to our procedure would need careful consideration to maintain the effectiveness of our standards and public confidence in those standards. This is critical to the role of a council. I also want to highlight the issue of press freedom and the vital role it plays in enabling quality journalism. These are very much within the purview of an effective and respected press council, and I intend to ensure that the Australian Press Council plays a part in debate on such matters. In Australia, we often take for granted that we live in a democracy that allows a free press and legitimate criticism. However, it's not quite that simple. Australia ranked 19th in the world last year, according to Reporters Without Borders report from 2017. Not an outstanding result, although we did move up from 25th. One can take some solace from that, but Australia is still behind many other countries in this area. This rating should be of concern to everyone. That concern is backed up by a number of worrying trends in Australia, and I'll touch briefly on them. The increasing use of defamation actions and the way in which that can be used in a digital world. Overly broad anti-terrorism laws. Secrecy laws that overclassify government information. Some courts seem too willing to issue suppression orders. Our metadata metadata retention laws, and lack of adequate protections for whistleblowers. Media outlets and the Press Council need to work energetically and cooperatively to counter these trends. In 2000, the Australian Press Council instituted a Press Freedom Medal to highlight the importance of press freedom and to recognise, initially, council members who had made an outstanding contribution to the work of the council in maintaining that freedom. Under David Weisbrot, the council decided in 2016 to revitalise this award and rightly open it up to people who, through their work as journalists or in other roles, help preserve the preservation of free speech, press freedom and open and transparent government. That award will be continued in 2018, and the council has considered some outstanding nominees. An announcement of the latest medal winners will be made next month. From its inception, the Press Council has been an alternative to government regulation. I have seen firsthand over the years both government regulation and industry regulation. There is no one solution that fits all circumstances and or all industries. Some areas need black letter government regulation, while others need a lighter touch and independence from government. Publishers rightly resist government regulation. A free press cannot be beholden to government or subject to undue government influence. Yet the public expects that the press will be responsible and adhere to high standards of journalistic behaviour. The Press Council, through its standards of practice, has enshrined and promoted good journalistic practice. Its complaints handling function gives the community the opportunity to air their grievances and to have those grievances considered in an independent forum. In some cases, the Press Council can be an alternative to costly defamation action. This process underpins quality journalism. Over time, the Press Council has been criticised as ineffective and subservient to publishers' interests. While it's true that publishers provide councils funding, an important change instituted during the time of Julian Disney as chair was not only to double council resources, but to lock that funding in for 3-year cycles. The council's constitution also provides for its independence. Only up to a maximum of 40% of the governing body is made up of publisher members, and 60% are public and independent journalist members. Adjudication panels that hear complaints do not include publisher members at all. The Constitution requires publishers to cooperate with the complaints handling processes, including the requirement to publish outcomes of all adjudications involving them. Editors take council adjudications seriously, and they certainly don't like having to publish critical adjudications. They tell us so, and sometimes they tell the world in editorials that accompany some adjudications. I'd like now to turn to the issue of council membership. Public members need to not only reflect the community, they must also be independent and seen as independent. The appointment of Carla McGrath to the council in the middle of last year and the reaction to that appointment threw into question the independence of council. While there is no question that Carla is an outstanding Australian, the issue revolves around whether her position as Deputy Chair of Get Up is compatible with her role as a council member. In late 2017, the council revised its existing practices and approved an overarching conflict of interest policy. All council members have now been asked to identify potential conflicts against that policy for consideration by council at its May meeting. I would also like to make some brief comment on council operations, particularly its core function of complaints handling. First, the approach by the Secretariat is highly professional and impartial. Each complainant is given appropriate consideration, even where it may be dismissed as not representing a breach of the council standards. Second, the council's adjudication panels bring a great deal of expertise to bear in their consideration of complaints. I've been genuinely impressed by the work done by all members of his panels, and in particular by the important role played by the independent journalist members. The average time for a complaint to be resolved is currently around 5 weeks. That sounds pretty good, particularly for a small organisation that receives more than 500 complaints a year. But formal adjudications on average are taking around 8 months from the date a complaint is received until the day the adjudication is published. While one can point to a number of valid reasons why it can take this length of time, I believe most people, particularly the complainants and the publishers involved in the complaint, believe that this is not ideal, and in some circumstances, I believe this delay diminishes the importance and relevance of the eventual finding. There is therefore work to be done in speeding up the adjudication processes and the complaints handling processes. In today's digital world, speed has become the accepted norm. I intend to work closely with Council to review our processes to reduce these times, but in ways that preserve the intent and effectiveness of the complaints system. In closing, I'd like to return to David Weisbrot's first speech here in 2015. I was struck by a theme developed by David during his tenure as something that I very much wish to continue. David said in that speech the following: "Whatever benefits these procedural refinements may deliver, they are likely to pale in comparison with the benefits that come from cultural change and the belief that the maintenance of high standards in the industry must be a shared enterprise." The defence of quality journalism is a shared enterprise, shared by all parties: the Press Council, publishers, journalists, the government and the public. All have a role to play if we are to maintain the tradition of quality journalism in the digital age. There is a story I remember from my Canberra days concerning ambassadors from Japan. It was said that one of their performance indicators was to leave the embassy's wine cellar in a better condition on their departure than it was on their arrival. My objective is to ensure that the Australian Press Council is a respected and independent self-regulatory body which has the confidence of publishers and the community, and which contributes to a strong and free press, and which values and promotes quality journalism. A council that has efficient and effective standards of practice and complaints handling that take into account the realities of a digital world. Thank you very much.
Clearly, this is a rapidly changing media environment in which we live, and we all understand that the growth of digital news sources and indeed the consumer market is rapidly moving away from traditional print models. Yet, I think it's true to say the work of the Press Council is still very much, in a structural sense, built around print publishing organisations, which undoubtedly, as an extension of their print work, accept the Council's adjudication in what they do on their websites. Yet, clearly these organisations are under great pressure in terms of maintaining their audience and particularly in maintaining a share of the advertising markets being gobbled up by Google, Facebook and others. So to cut a long question short, do you feel that the Council perhaps needs to change its approach to dealing with the work of newspapers to accept the reality that while they are subject to this very intensive scrutiny and adjudication of their activities and their standards, that there's a wild west of other players out there who don't face up to any of that?
Thank you, Mark. I did touch on a couple of those issues in my speech. Yes, the Council does have to look at how it looks at the online world. There are emerging challenges there that we will need to address. We do have a range of online publication members, online-only publication members, and they are prepared to work with Council and to be bound by Council standards. Yes, it's a big wide world out there. There's any number of alternative sources. I guess the message I'm seeing is that there's an increasing trend, though, for people wanting to trust more traditional media rather than to rely simply upon blogs or other media activities. And that trust is really underpinned, I think, by the fact that publishers do commit to be bound by the standards of the Press Council. So I think in the digital world it's even more important that the standards are there, that we uphold those standards, but that we recognise that the way in which we go about our business is going to change because of the digital world, but it doesn't, I think, diminish the importance of those standards for the community to have confidence in that media. And today's fake news, it's, I think, a really important distinction.
Okay, up the back.
My name's Sue Elson from 120 Ways Publishing. I don't think I've got any connections with anything that's suspicious, so I'll just move ahead. You mentioned something about the core function of the Press Council being about complaints handling, but you also mentioned the fact that if we're going to move forward, there needs to be more media literacy. So could you please explain, is that the role of the Press Council, or is there something that we can do, or is there some other body that should be held responsible for that media literacy training?
Okay, yes, complaints handling is the core function, and it's not the only function, and the Council certainly does have a remit that goes beyond just complaints handling, as I said earlier. Media literacy, I think, is a shared responsibility as well. It can't just be the Press Council to do that. I think governments have some involvement there too. I've been talking to ACMA about some of these issues and the Federal Department. I think the issue of media literacy is important in an age where there's so many alternative sources of media and people don't quite know where to go sometimes. So not just a Press Council role, no, we're not resourced to do that. You know, we can play our part, but it has to be a part shared by others as well.
Yeah, Barry Donovan.
Welcome to the Melbourne Press Club.
Thank you.
Barry Donovan of the Melbourne Press Club. I'd just like to, I'm sure with everyone that is here, wish you the best of luck in your new role. My question is that my understanding is that with the Press Council, it mainly operates with occasional complaints, concerns that are brought to the Press Council for you to look at, examine and adjudicate. What the added question I'm asking is, do you feel that going ahead that there would be major media issues that develop that may involve the way that a particular paper does something, or maybe a general public issue that is being taken up and you feel is getting a bit sort of, going a bit out of balance? Do you see that in the future that you could have a role with the Press Council to actually go out and identify an issue that is concerning the general public and take an active role in examining that on behalf of the Council, apart from things that are brought to you?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for the good wishes of luck too. I think I'm going to need it, but thank you very much. I appreciate it. Two aspects to that question, two aspects to the answer to that question. Firstly, the Council is proactive when it looks at standards and in terms of trying to develop, in conjunction with publishers, the appropriate standards for treatment of certain areas. For example, we have a separate standard on suicide reporting. There's a standard on privacy. There's a standard on hospital patients. So we can be proactive when we see a general issue but it's concerning people, and where we believe that a standard or an advisory guideline might be useful, and the Council in that sense is proactive. Traditionally, the Council has not in itself initiated complaints against the press. That hasn't been a function of the Council to date, and I think that the approach of trying to look at general issues is the better one to do. So yes, there is a role, but it's more in a more general sense. When we identify issues that we think need to be taken into account where the community is concerned, let's work together with publishers to develop either guidelines or standards.
Thanks, Neville. I appreciate your speech and for reminding us of all the different ways people consume news. My name's Karis Palmer. I'm with The Conversation. I'm interested in any progress on the Media Innovation Fund and Press Council's involvement with that, and what you'd like to see that money invested in.
Well, the Media Innovation Fund is actually being run by the government, of course, and I think ACMA have been given responsibility for administering it. The intention, I think, was to involve the Press Council as part of that approach, and to date, we haven't yet worked it out with ACMA. That's still being done within the government at this stage as they develop the guidelines for how that fund will work. They've talked to us about it in general terms, but nothing specific has emerged yet that I can report on. But look, I think it's a good initiative. I think anything that helps journalism in this country is a welcome initiative.
Richard Ferguson from the Australian newspaper. Mr. Stevens, thank you very much for your speech. Just on the issue of Carla McGrath, do you believe that Ms McGrath will stack up to the new conflict of interest policy when it comes to the meeting in May? And have you considered reviewing her position at the council independently of that at all?
I really outlined a position earlier, which is that in December the council did adopt the overarching conflict of interest guidelines, and all council members, including Carla, will be assessed against those guidelines. And that will happen at its May meeting. It would really be inappropriate for me to preempt council deliberations on these issues by expressing my view now.
David Forster, a former lawyer and now a happy student at RMIT on journalism. There is obviously a fairly big smell about a lot of regulators, including the Department of Ag and the live sheep business. Is there a danger that if your organisation doesn't become proactive on fake news, that in time to come, the Joe citizen in the street's going to be starting to say that the Press Council is just a bit of a wank?
I think fake news is something that goes beyond the Press Council. It clearly is an issue for the Press Council, but it's also an issue for the government and the community. And it's a shared risk. We, as a Press Council, we can't change what's happening, but we can work with others to see how it can be combated. And I've had some discussions with the federal government about that very point in the last couple of weeks as to what is the best way of tackling it, because clearly it has great potential to disrupt a whole range of things. I agree with that. But no one has an answer just yet.
Any more questions in the room? Just at this point, I might say, you raised this point about complaints adjudication, and clearly that's at the heart of what the Press Council has always done. You kind of indicated that it's the volume's overwhelming, the delays are very long, and yet in this environment that you've described very eloquently, of the challenges to the media broadly and the industry as a whole, do you feel that there's a need perhaps for the council to become more of an advocate and more proactive in that advocacy space on behalf of good journalism and journalistic standards, and perhaps try and pull the rein a little bit on the adjudication process, which I think is a huge amount of work, and I think in many cases a lot of the complaints, if I can declare a conflict of interest, I was sat on the council for a couple of times, but I think a lot of them proved ultimately to be quite trivial and without merit. So is there a case to say perhaps a little bit less on complaints and a bit more on fighting the good fight?
I think there's a balance to be struck here, Mark, to be honest. I think the complaints handling mechanism is still core to our activities, because it's what gives the community the opportunity to make a complaint against something that has concerned them in the media. I think that always has to be the case. As I said earlier, I think some of the timelines are too long, and we need to work within council to actually make those easier, and hopefully that might make it easier for publishers as well. It's not easy for publishers sometimes to respond, and it can be, the longer the period goes on, it's harder for the journalists to remember exactly why they even wrote that story. So time is important here, and we need to sort of streamline it so that perhaps we and the press spend a little bit less resources on it, but it still has to be effective, because if the community doesn't feel they have an avenue for legitimate complaint, then I think that will undermine the trust in the media. I mean, I've seen a number of complaints now, some of which have never got to adjudication because the Secretariat believes that they really do not have very much merit, and I would agree with that. Others even somewhat go to adjudication. You'd probably argue perhaps that's not the most serious offence, that might be the case, but others are really serious, and I think without that avenue for the public, we wouldn't be able to maintain that trust in the media, and I believe that if we didn't have an effective system within the Press Council, there'd be a lot of calls for government regulation to actually take over from that. And I think, therefore, I think we are going to have to balance. We're going to have to chew gum and walk at the same time.
Sorry, Mr. Stevens, Richard Ferguson again from the Australian.
Yeah.
I get 2 questions because I don't have any friends. I was just wondering, sir, following on your strong comments on press freedom, what the Council's view was on the proposed whistleblowers scheme by the federal government, and why the Council did not make a submission to the government?
Yeah, look, the answer is that the reason the submission wasn't made was because it coincided with a transition to a new chair, and it simply didn't happen as a part of that process. Going forward, we were making submissions on these issues, and only this week we've made a submission to the South Australian Attorney-General in regard to journalist shield laws. So I take that seriously, and we will, going forward, ensure we do make those submissions.
Sorry, so just quickly on the journalist shield laws, what was your position on that?
We support the legislation which is being proposed, and wish it was nationwide and uniform.
Thank you again for a wonderful presentation and your frank answers to our questions, and best of luck in the new role.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.